Hey everyone, welcome back to the Becoming Podcast. This is episode 3, Kris.
Yes,
We're back at it.
I love it.
And today we're going to talk about the meaning of everything on suffering. That's what we talked about this last weekend. Really challenging topic, and it's going to be good. So we're going to jump into that here in just a bit.
Yep.
First of all, as always, thank you for joining us.
Yes.
If you could do us a favor, whether you're watching on YouTube or listening on your podcast app, could you continue to please like and subscribe and share to this podcast? It's just an easy way to get the word out, continue the conversation together as we are on this journey of becoming together.
Yeah.
We're going to take these sermons that we've been doing the last couple of weeks and dive just a little bit deeper and have these conversations. So those of you that have been joining and responding and dialoguing, thank you for that.
Yeah.
We want to just continue to be with you through this conversation. And with that, please ask your questions. We need your questions for the podcast so that we can dialogue and have these conversations. So don't forget to text Bean as questions to 9400. So if you hear something during the sermon that kind of sparks your interest or sparks a particular question, please ask it, even if it's maybe a weird question or a challenging question. If it's a really hard question, I'm going to give it to Kris. And
well, the thing of it is, if you don't ask your questions, we're going to make up our own, and we'll always make up questions that we know we can answer. So you don't want that.
Yeah.
Who wants that?
We want to keep it interesting. So please ask us hard questions so we don't have to come up with our own.
Yeah.
But no, it's been good so far, and we're gonna jump right in here. So this weekend was on suffering. Yeah. So Kris, maybe just share a couple of thoughts from the message this weekend.
Well, I was very blessed and thrilled to hear you preach. I always am challenged to think differently about the word and my own response to all of that. So you use this U diagram. I'm sure you're going to talk about that. And when you talked about the idea, this notion that's out there of what's called a spiritual bypass, and where we try to figure out ways that I can go from the place where suffering kind of begins straight across to where the hope and the life and the resurrection is, and never have to go down into the depths of that U. And we were talking about this yesterday a little bit, how that concept is not just a spiritual one. That's a concept in the business world of businesses that really want to experience significant transition, positive transition, have to make that descent into the valley of the shadow of despair, and then to come out of that to see gain and improvement and growth. And so I was pondering that spiritual bypass issue, and I was left with wondering this. Could it be that as Christ followers, whether you're a Christ follower or you're not, suffering happens to all of us. We're not exempt. Okay. Sometimes when we experience suffering, especially when maybe the suffering we're experiencing is because of a decision we made, a choice we made, oftentimes we can interpret that as a personal failure. And we don't like failure. We don't like to deal with failure. We don't like to have other people remind us of our failure. We don't like to think about the outcomes of failure. And so it's very easy. So I can avoid the whole failure thing to just somehow magically, I guess, go from on that dotted line from the point of where suffering begins to the point of hope and life, because I can't face my failure. And I think we really set ourselves up for some problems, and maybe Josh, stunt some of our spiritual growth by just saying, oh, because I'm going through suffering, it's because I failed. I failed myself. I failed God. I failed a person, somebody significant in my life, which then compounds the whole thing. And then I feel not only terrible about the suffering I'm in, but that I'm also a failure. And this goes back to some of the schemes of the devil, how the enemy will then, because we bring those thoughts to our minds, and then the enemy comes in, seizes the opportunity and says, oh yeah, that's right, you're a failure. And we just won't accept some of the growth and the good things that can happen in the bottom of that you by saying, you know what, number one, I'm not a failure. I am suffering, and this does hurt. Whether it's something outside of my control or something that was well within my control, to journey through that and not build the little magical bridge it goes across. And I hope, if you didn't see the sermon or didn't watch the live stream this weekend, you're probably going, what in the world are you talking about? I don't know if there's a way we can put a picture, a link to that somehow.
Yeah, I think what I'll do is I'll explain.
Because I thought that was great visual. Great visual.
I'll re-explain it here in a second, and I can drop it into the screen
and paint the picture, Josh, in our mind.
Yeah, I don't know if I'm that good, but no, you bring up a really great point of this intersection of wanting to go down into the you and facing our failure, the feeling of failure. And I think that's huge, because what happens is, again, when we go back to the definition of spiritual bypass, I said that sometimes we cover up our unfinished business by doing and saying spiritual things. And so I know for me, my temptation is, well, if I just do more for God, if I whatever it might be, if I try to pray more or read my Bible more or serve more, then somehow I can sort of outweigh these sort of eternal scales that are happening in my head that feed into that failure thing. And so if I can just do so much that it outweighs that feeling of failure, then I'll be okay. But that failure will not go away by just doing more. It actually might lead us further into that place of despair. So we have to be aware of maybe those moments when we are using spiritual things to kind of cover up some stuff that's beneath the surface, where we may need to come to a place where we have to confess, I need to slow down. I just need to slow down, because I'm not helpful to anybody right now.
Sure. Yeah. And have plague will travel, right?
Yeah. No, that's such a great point.
Oh man.
Yeah, very good. And so maybe to reiterate, those of you that maybe haven't watched the sermon yet, I talked about the U diagram. So this was a diagram, very simple diagram created by Kathy Lorzell, and she uses this to help people walk through trauma and help us help others walk through trauma in particular. And I think it's applicable to our own just general experiences as followers of Jesus. And the general idea is that we the Christian narrative, the core of the Christian narrative, is summed up in 3 days: the crucifixion and trauma of Friday, the death. We could also use some other biblical metaphors: the valley of the shadow of death. We could use the wilderness, the desert, that place of death on Saturday.
Which we don't talk much about Saturday in the whole Easter
we really
narrative.
Don't. Yeah, maybe we could unpack that.
There's some really cool symbolism there.
Yeah, for sure. And then leads us to Resurrection Sunday. So it's in the shape of a U, and I talked about how the way of Jesus is the way of suffering and death. And so as followers of Jesus, we're invited to enter into that U and invited to walk the way of Jesus. Because that is the only way to experience new life on the other side.
Which is backwards.
It's upside down.
It's totally upside down to culture. It can even be upside down in the church.
Yeah.
Because we can get a little bit skewed. And I've heard stories, Josh, of people sharing their experiences in other faith communities where somehow this weird damaging idea can emerge that the reason you're suffering is because you don't have enough faith. That's just not biblical.
Yeah.
Just not biblical. Because when you watch the pattern of Christ, you see himself not only inviting others with him on that journey of suffering, but his purposeful willingness to suffer, which led to life. And what a pattern that is for us as we journey through. This might be a little bit of what Paul was talking about, that as he was describing our relationship with Jesus in participating in the sufferings of Christ, that part of and necessary to the growth that needs to emerge within us is in many ways through suffering, right through it. Now the challenge is, don't get stuck.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Don't get stuck.
Right. And we have and Paul reiterates this so well, is that the very same God who raised Jesus from the dead will raise us up as well.
To new
and so
life.
we have someone who has gone before us, and not only who has gone before us, but who is with us as Jesus walks us through this valley or this into new life. And I think the key component is to remember that as we embrace suffering well, it's for the benefit of others.
Yeah.
That's so important as we walk with Jesus. And I think I mentioned this at least one of the services, but I think that is probably our greatest evangelistic tool in our tool belt, is to have the capacity to walk with someone through the you. Because what we can often do, Kris, is we can have this sort of posture of like, I have something that you don't have, and let me tell you about it.
Yeah.
And we do all the talking,
right?
And we don't shut up and just listen to somebody.
Yeah.
And we can get real kind of power trippy when it comes to this gospel message that we have. But instead, what if our posture was,
open hands.
Tell me about your day.
Yep.
And walk with someone as they might be suffering pretty significantly. And they're not going to remember anything we said.
Yeah.
But they're going to remember that we were right there next to them.
Yeah.
And walking with them.
Yeah.
I wonder if that's way more powerful than our words.
Yeah. So I'm reminded of a book I used to read to my kids. Mendy and I would both read this book to them. And it was a book written sometime in the 40s, 1940s decade somewhere. I don't remember the exact date. The author was a woman named Hannah Hurnard. And she wrote a book called Hinds Feet on High Places. And it's an allegory of Jesus and us, right? And so they make a kid's version of this book that's got some beautiful, very vivid imagery on each page, but it tells the story in a way that maybe 12 and younger could understand. And I remember we'd read that book several times through. And we get to this part where one of the main characters is this girl named Much Afraid. And she's trying to follow after the chief shepherd, who is Jesus. And there's this part where Much Afraid, this girl who has a limp and her mouth is crooked, and she's just got all these issues, right? And she goes into this desert, like she's wanting to go up to the mountains because the high places is where all the good stuff happens, right? The victory, the resurrection, the I'm out of the village of the Fearings was the little town she was from. And I remember I get so frustrated even reading the kids' book to my kids because Much Afraid is like dwelling in these low places. I'm like, and you turn the next page and she's still there, right? And so I just sometimes we get very impatient with ourselves when we're going through maybe physical suffering, spiritual suffering, relational suffering. We just get impatient. We want God to fix it. I've prayed like 12 minutes for this. Come on, God, get me out of this deal. And and sometimes in my own life, I can look back and saying those prayers to the Lord. He's like, well, you got yourself into this deal. You get yourself out. It's like, come on, I'm with you, but don't stay stuck there. And so that book, it's a great book. I highly recommend reading it, but because it is the journey of suffering and then new life. But I found myself incredibly frustrated with how long we can often stay down in the bottom of that whether it's of our own doing or the Lord's doing.
Yeah. It reminds me of someone recently told a story I heard of a gentleman who came for prayer and was asking to be delivered from a very specific struggle that they were dealing with, and the pastor wisely told him no. And he said, sometimes God will not deliver us from things, but he will walk through us, with us through these things.
Yeah.
And that's the truth sometimes. Sometimes we are pleading, and don't get me wrong, I believe that God can deliver us from any circumstance and situation, but there's something really powerful when God might tap us on the shoulder and say, hey, this is something you need to go through, and I'm going to be with you every step of the way.
Yes.
So that there's new life on the other side.
Yep.
So
absolutely.
Yeah, powerful example. So so let's jump into our first question.
Well, you had a couple interactions.
Yeah, and these are where some of these questions are coming from. Some folks after church had some just really good comments and things that they were wrestling with and thinking about. And so this first one, a couple people came up to me and had just kind of this thought of like, as I'm thinking about this, and they were genuinely wrestling of just like, how do I, what do I do when I feel like my suffering seems so small compared to others? And so I think both of them referenced just the situation in Ukraine, for example.
Right.
My suffering, it seems so small in light of what my brothers and sisters are going through there. So how can I even begin to like think about my own stuff when they're going through that? So Kris, maybe how do we approach that? Because it's kind of a tricky balance.
Well, I think it's a healthy exercise to definitely be reflective on the suffering of others. You and I are not the center of the universe. To take that step back and acknowledge that they're the plight of others, whether it's something as incredible as like what's happening in Ukraine, or think of any other places and conflicts that have occurred in our world where people's homes are taken from them, their families are split apart, if not killed, systems of government completely fall apart. You name it, it's occurring. So I think it is a positive, reflective thing to go, okay, that is pretty massive what's happening out there or around me or whatever. But I think the balance is to also say, I'm not going to let that be an excuse to not deal with my own. I think it's actually the mark of maturity to be able to say, yes, I've got my issues, I've got my pain, I've got some brokenness in my life, but it's not the worst thing in the world. Others are going through much more difficult circumstances than I am. But then I think in that acknowledgement, it helps maybe in some way frame our own suffering, not in a way to say, well, then I'm not even going to deal with mine because it pales in comparison, but to acknowledge it and let that maybe bring you to a place of prayer for them, and then go, all right, Lord, now can we talk about me for a bit? That's okay. That's okay. And so I think you can certainly let that thought and that recognition of what's going on around us play a part in framing and shaping our journey through our own suffering. And I don't know, I've heard this, I think it's true, that we are still given a divine ability that even in the depths of our suffering, God will still prompt our hearts to pray for others. And that could be part of the healing process for us. So incorporate it.
Yeah. And it reminds me of this idea that our empathy for others is kind of like a muscle. It's like, I don't think like people are born with the ability to have empathy. Some people are maybe better and more natural at it than others, but it is a thing that has to be deeply practiced in our lives. So I need to be working on having empathy for myself and my own story and for others, so that I can have that capacity for empathy with others. And so I can't even begin to show empathy for these people who are experiencing immense suffering beyond what I can imagine, unless I really begin to make meaning of my own. And so we really have to be intentional about working that muscle of stepping down into our own places of death. And at the same time, I love how Henry Nouwen writes in his Wounded Healer book of we are tending to our own wounds and at the same time being able to tend to others. That's the life of the wounded healer.
I go back to the parable that Jesus told of the Good Samaritan, and how, I mean, yes, this man tends to this person who is beat up and left for dead, but that Samaritan had his own wounds too. He had some systemic wounds, how the Jews thought of Samaritans, and yet he still reached out even in the midst of his own maybe corporate suffering that he was going through. Maybe that had even trickled to him individually, knowing that he would not be accepted among the Jews, and yet still reached out. I think that's an example of a correctly developed muscle of empathy right there. And and
it extends to our circumstances when it comes to sort of systemic suffering. Our ability to be able to extend empathy to problems of race or problems of suffering that's going on across the world that we can't really even begin to understand. So where does that send you, Kris, as you think about the systemic suffering that takes place?
And we have our own sets of systemic suffering right in our own country, whether it's race issues of food depravity, of homelessness, of just some of the injustices that are just flat out oppressive and wrong and destructive in a community, right? And so as a church, I think we have a couple ways we can respond to that, but I would imagine that we can find the most Christ-like response to some of those systemic issues with developing empathy and letting that muscle, as you say, really come to its fullest capacity, so that we're able to say, you know what, even in the midst of what I'm dealing with, I can still be the hands and feet of Christ into these very broken places in our world, in our country, right in our own backyard, where we see even still some evidences of some of those systemic things that are going on right in our own community, that we can step into that as we are also in the bottom of that U.
Yeah, and when we develop that capacity, we can, for example, I think about, especially with the issue of racism and how so just polarized it's become.
It is very polarized.
I wonder sometimes, I know for me, I'm speaking for myself, is that sometimes I I want to kind of push away from those conversations because I'm struggling maybe with my own empathy, my capacity for empathy. But I know that when I'm really in tune with what's going on in my own life, I can start to begin to see the suffering that has been inflicted when it comes to racism, especially in our country. And I'm no longer taking this position, this sort of defensive position, because I'm actually blocking my own feelings of being uncomfortable or awkward about the conversation. But I no longer have to be at a place where I make these ultimatums about what's going on. And I can just simply come to a place where I just say, "Oh, Lord, have mercy. Forgive me." As someone who is a white male in this white male dominant society, God, forgive me for the things that I have done, but also the things that I have left undone. And that becomes the fertile ground for us to begin to develop some serious empathy for some of the conversations that we might have the tendency to push back on sometimes.
Well, I don't know, I'm beginning to get the gist of suffering, that suffering is not really solely rooted in me curling up in the fetal position in the corner of the room, sucking my thumb, and hopefully it goes away. It's actually an invitation to some really cool things, uncomfortable things. But some amazing ways in which we see the richness of God's grace flowing through us to others in their suffering. It goes back to community. It really does.
This really drives us into really thinking about what does it mean to be faithful in those places of death, and how ultimately it can really benefit those around us.
For sure.
And that's huge. That's huge.
Hey everyone, wanted to give you a couple of quick announcements of some things coming up this weekend. Number one is 21 Days of Prayer. This weekend, you're going to be receiving a prayer guide. It's going to pace you through every single day of this 21-day journey. We've got some surprises involved with that. It's a very interactive 21 Days of Prayer. It's prayer that gets us into the community. We are super stoked about that. So make sure this weekend you get your copy of the prayer guide. We're also going to provide it as a downloadable PDF that you can have, but primarily want to make sure you've got that guide in your hand this weekend, because 21 Days of Prayer starts on this coming Monday, March 28th. And then the other thing I just wanted to remind you of is our service times. Saturday night at 6 p.m. and 10:30 a.m. on Sunday morning. We look forward to seeing you as we worship together. Have a great week.
Okay, so we have our next question, Kris, and this one sort of comes from another conversation about that happened after church, and someone was talking about how they had a family member that seems to be stuck in the place of death and despair.
Okay.
And so the question that came up for me is like, what happens if like me or someone else I know is kind of stuck in that place of death? How can we, again, we just talked about like developing our muscle for empathy, which is a big part of that. How can we begin to maybe help people and begin to take initiative for ourselves about how we might get unstuck in those places of death? So what comes to mind to you when you first think about that?
Well, you certainly want to be aware and sensitive to, where people are at in their suffering, okay? It's very easy for us, like deep times of suffering and death that we've gone through, to then make it the template that's the way everybody should go through it, right? So you're taking too long down there, and so we need to resist that. However, it is a very common thing for that feeling of being stuck, and this is kind of hard, and this comes out of innumerable counseling sessions I've had with people who are experiencing different levels of suffering. And one of the common threads that I see that contributes to being stuck is I just can't let go of the past. This clinging, this desperate clinging to the way it was before, whatever that was, before I lost someone, before I experienced a level of pain or brokenness in my life, a separation, a divorce, a death, a financial ruin or crisis, whatever it might be. It's like I wish it never would have happened. And this is a very vicious, destructive cycle that we can be in, that all that does is just dig our hole deeper to be stuck, because we won't let go of what it was before. The good memories, the joys, the fellowships, the life, whatever that was. And so I believe that is one of the deepest works that God wants to do in the lives of his people. Because that stems right back to this root of I have to be in control. And if we can release that control, it allows us to release the past. It allows us to release where we're stuck. And I'm not saying, okay, I'm going to be real clear here, that we forget all that, especially in the case of loss. We have families in our own church, Josh, that have lost significant people in their family. They're lost significantly to the church. But man, we can get so mired in that loss and in that death because we just wish it never would have happened. And that's something God wants to deliver us from. I'm convinced of it. And he will, that's like the last thing we cling to, right? This last bit of control of just the way it was. I just want it the way it was. And to be able to release that, we'll begin to make that journey up the upside of the U,
Yeah. It reminds me of this phrase within recovery circles of trying our best to stay within reality at all costs. Because a lot of the ways we stay stuck for too long in the place of death is we are fantasizing in one way or another about a reality that's not real.
We've created a reality.
And to be able to just faithfully and courageously name what's going on and what's at stake. And sometimes that leads us to some pretty challenging places.
Oh, sure.
Where we start to take inventory. And like I said in the sermon, we might have to come to a place where we say, and I quoted Richard Rohr, where he's lamenting and confessing, always someone else has to suffer because I don't know how to.
We spread it. Yeah.
Like when we start to look beyond ourselves for a moment, as God is working in us and convicting us and leading us, we recognize, oh man, there's a lot of people suffering because I'm not suffering well. And so we're led to this place where we confess and admit, I have gripped onto this sense of control for too long. And it's not working.
So this is where you were saying, I think I remember this in your message, where because we don't know how to suffer well, we then inflict suffering on others. It's like, it's just whatever was supposed to come into our lives and transform us has somehow been converted to something that could be caustic to others, because whether it's because we want to remain stuck, we don't know how to suffer well, we get, I don't know, angry, frustrated, depressed, bitter, resentful. Yeah.
All the above.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so we wrestle with that. And at the same time, and this is such a delicate,
It is.
It's such a delicate balance
is.
because we were even talking about this morning of we don't want to come to a place where we're impatiently, even to ourselves, like you just need to get over it, or you just need to get over it.
We stand up here, somebody's down at the bottom of the U, right? What's your problem?
Yeah.
Because we're standing up here, we don't know what they're going through down there. That's
like,
the balance.
And some people are, and I think this needs to be made very clear. Some people are stuck in the basement, and there is nothing that you and I can do sometimes, right. but just be present. And we'll talk about this in a little bit. And sometimes these folks might need some trusted guides, some experienced people to help them get unstuck because like you said, it's real. The place of death can be very real, very constricting. And sometimes we get stuck there. And so, we're trying to find this delicate balance between I know there's something real and beautiful and about going into that place of death, but yet there's a point where we're going to be invited onto the other side. And that might be in very small moments that God, even in the midst of a difficult situation, had just reminded today of just like sometimes in those moments of difficulty, I'm reminded of God's beauty as I watch the birds on my bird feeder right outside the door. That's just even if it's those little glimpses of where we just take a moment and delight in God's goodness. Sometimes those are the most special moments where we even in our place of suffering, we get to see a glimpse of what's on the other side.
Well, and there's that other thing that I take a lot of joy in is that sound that a turbocharger makes at about 5,200 RPM. Well, anyway,
it's different for everyone, right?
You like doves, I like turbochargers.
Like or just putting my hands to work
to wood,
or
you need to see his garage.
Or
it's pretty cool.
Taking pictures. That brings up an interesting point is that as we're in this process of and maybe this will kind of segue us into the last question is like what are some practical ways that I can embrace suffering well? Like what does it mean? Because like we've talked about, and I hope we've reinforced this, is that we're gonna dip into this place of you.
You will.
I will.
We're
gonna experience suffering, and I mentioned the expanse of that. That could be physical suffering. That could be a relational suffering. That could be emotional suffering. Traumatic suffering. It could be a lot of things. So, what Kris, are some ways, and we can start just brainstorming together about what are some of these practical ways that we can begin to faithfully enter into the place of death and also find new life on the other side.
Yep, for sure. Well, I think this has been mentioned in each of our podcasts. We try to emphasize this, how important the community of faith is.
Yeah.
How we really do need each other. And to be able to suffer with others who are suffering. Now, we need to make sure it's with the right people, okay? And what I mean by that is too often we can fall into the trap of like attracts like. And so if we're stuck and bitter and resentful, then the natural tendency is we're going to find other stuck, bitter, and resentful people. And then all of a sudden we just have a big bitterness party. And it doesn't do anything. And you walk away from that, if you really analyze it, not any healthier, right?
Yeah.
But there are communities where life can be breathed into those dark, dark places. I think of a couple of groups that we have here at our church. One of them is called Grief Share, where these are people who are either currently engaged in suffering, have been through suffering. They have a testimony about that. But But to be in a setting communally with others where there is words of life being spoken, not words of death. That's massively important. You talked about a guide earlier. It doesn't mean that we're a broken, messed up person destined for the garbage heap if we have a counselor in our lives. And having that person who can kind of be ahead of us just a little bit to point out some of the road markers, to begin to say, hey, there's going to be a curve coming up here. You need to ease up a little bit, and I'll walk with you through it. Having that person that's just there in your life. It could be a pastor, it could be a licensed counselor, a therapist, whatever that looks like, but that guide that's there to walk with you. And then Josh, I would just say practically too, and this is I would say a very basic step, but I think one of the hardest steps to take is to invite Jesus, invite the Lord into the valley of that shadow of death that we can be in, because he is so faithful. And our fallen human tendency is to not only give the hand to other people, right? When we're hurting, we want to isolate ourselves. We sometimes give it to God too. And we're like, I just need to get through this. Well, you're not operating with one hand tied behind your back. It's two hands tied behind your back when we can't or won't engage the Almighty into this process.
And that brings up a good point, that this is where lamenting and grieving really comes in.
Yeah.
Because sometimes, and this is where we have the opportunity to be really honest with God. And we have plenty of examples in Scripture, especially in the Psalms, where the psalmist kind of pushed back on God.
Oh yeah.
And said, God, where are you at?
Yeah.
Because I don't see you. I don't feel you. I'm not experiencing you. I feel like I'm down in death without any help. Where are you, God? And as we read the Psalms, we of course the lament, the pattern of lament is so beautiful, because it begins with that just sort of pleading with God of just like, where are you? And towards the end, there's this somehow this turn where it's like, God, I know that you're with me. I know that somehow you're with me. And I know you want and want the very best for me. And so it's okay to go into those places where we can be upset with God. Or we can really lean in and say, God, this is what I'm feeling. And I heard once that when it comes to lament and being angry at God, sometimes we can kind of push back against that. We're like, we're not allowed to be angry at God. God's not going to be offended by our anger. And what actually this anger towards God expresses how much we care about our relationship with God.
Absolutely.
And so it's actually a sign that we are taking this seriously when we really go into that place of grief and lament and start to maybe even duke it out with God a little bit as we're working through this
stuff. Let that be part of the wrestling through the bottom of that U. Sometimes there's a wrestling match down there. Sometimes there's a tussle, a struggle. and that's a good thing. That's where the growth occurs, and we ask greater and deeper questions to God and to those around us, and we're like, okay, I'm seeing a pathway here. It may take a while, but that's a good place to be. Good place to be. And I like what you brought out. You look at the journey of the psalmist, and I was just thinking, you could probably lay that you over on many of his outcries and the deep, dark places that David was at. Yeah,
I think it's Psalm 42. Why is my soul
so downcast?
That's a great one.
It is.
That's a great one to live with, and to sit with for a while as we lament. And so, this is good. And so we're invited. As I close the sermon, I'll close with this today. is Henry Nouwen writes that the way in is the way out.
The way out.
Or another writer says this, is that the only way out is through. And so church, as we engage in this practice of suffering well, our prayer is that you would richly and with curiosity dive into those places where pain and suffering needs to be met, so that we can experience joy and flourishing on the other side.
Amen.
That's so huge. And so again, we can't begin to unpack all of this, but maybe this is a starting point for you to begin to think about some of the ways that we can embrace suffering well.
Yeah.
So again, thanks for joining us. If you guys have questions or want to continue the conversation, just text us. We want to field your questions. Kris, I think we're talking about salvation this next week.
Yes, we are. But it's not going to be the way most people will think about salvation. I'm just going to leave you with this.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, the church, here we go, has been communicating a misguided message about salvation. And the biggest reason is we don't know our Bibles very well. So we're going to look, what is the actual biblical story of the redemption that God has in mind in bringing the kingdom of God to this earth? Because a world that doesn't know Jesus needs to hear it in a way that we're being biblical. I'll leave it there.
Okay.
It's going to be great.
Yeah.
This is going to be a good week to invite a friend.
Yeah. Okay.
Because some of our friends believe a story we're telling, we may not be telling the right story.
Okay.
So, yeah, bring a friend.
Great. Good. We're looking forward to it. So thanks again for joining us, guys. We will see you soon. Have a great rest of your week. God bless. See you guys.